Good evening. My name is Angie Brenner. I am the city librarian for Mill Valley and the curator of First Fridays. Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the Mill Valley Library Foundation and the Friends for their generous support of tonight's program, and let you know that in September, the foundation hosts their annual Beyond the Book Bash, a fabulous evening of entertainment, and the Friends hold their annual two-day book sale, making a great selection of books available at bargain prices. So we hope you will consider attending one or both events. After tonight's talk, the author will be signing his books in the lobby. We've all heard about classical musicians practicing 6 hours a day. What would happen if concert pianists practiced in a way that specifically addressed their intended performances? A suite or variation lasts a few minutes. A whole concert maybe an hour. There's a precedence for this idea. One of the 20th century's greatest virtuosos, Glenn Gould, did exactly that. Practiced for just 2 or 3 hours a day, but with a focus that matched the technical intensity and duration of what he intended to achieve before an audience. For him, practicing pretty well for 6 hours bore no resemblance to what would happen in Carnegie Hall. In many ways, Gould's instinctive insight anticipated a revolution in sports science and training theory that tonight's speaker discusses. For example, multiple Tour de France winners Team Sky doesn't send its riders out on those aimless 6-hour death marches so typical of the past. A bike race at that level demands, just like a concert performance, very specific adaptations that can only be acquired if the training is similarly very specific. Mark McClusky, a journalist and editor with a long involvement in sports, is interested in this relatively recent conjunction of athletics and the modern world. His wonderful new book, Faster, Higher, Stronger, chronicles the revelations of this critical intersection of systems analysis, demographics, and piecemeal scientific research. When we stop guessing and creatively apply real knowledge, many new and exciting things become possible. And not just for world-class athletes, but for all of us, whether improving our backhands or our 5K personal best, even our piano playing. Please welcome Mark McClusky.
So I'm Mark. I wrote this book, and what really drew me to it was this intersection of sports and science and technology, and how it has led to the progression that we see in all sorts of athletic endeavors. And people ask me, no, but seriously, why did you write it? And I tell them a story about this kid, who's me. In age 17, so you can't read the jersey, perhaps it says Franklin Shop and Save. I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania racing bicycles, and Shop and Save was the local supermarket. This is 1989. Cycling was not a particularly popular sport, certainly in western Pennsylvania in a small town, and I talked the manager of the local grocery store into sponsoring a cycling team, which meant he gave me $1,000 so I could print up jerseys and pay some hotel bills. Having formed a team, I needed teammates, so that's where the kid in the front comes in. That's my best friend, Mike Dittman, growing up. Mike had been a swimmer, and I convinced him to become a cyclist because really, like, a team of one is not so much a team as it is a person. And we spent a lot of time driving around western Pennsylvania and northeast Ohio racing bikes, which made me, I was pretty good. I won a bunch of bike races, but I was a medium-sized fish in what turned out to be an incredibly small pond at that time. And I had these sorts of dreams that the kids do when they're athletes. I dreamed of really cool sunglasses and an amazing haircut. That mullet is that's November 1988, as it says in the corner there. And I dreamed of going to the Olympics. I dreamed of being a pro. I got European cycling magazines in the mail, which was really hard to do at the time. And I put posters up on my wall of people like Greg LeMond and Bernard Hinault and Phil Anderson and these Stephen Roche, who rode for a team called Carrera. That's the jersey that I have somehow found and am wearing there with my crap print Oakley sunglasses. So I went to college and kept racing bikes in college, and I got killed in college. I was beaten so badly, so very badly, and frankly, I handled it really poorly. We qualified for nationals my first year in college, and we just got annihilated. I'd never felt so outclassed in a bike race as I did that day, and I hated it. And I wondered what had happened. I fundamentally didn't understand why I got beaten so badly. And I stopped racing, which, looking back on it, makes me a little bit sad. It's also a sign that I was not meant to be at that level, because if I quit at the first hurdle, that's really not how you get to the elite level. And I started doing other things. I became a writer and a reporter, and I managed to fulfill my Olympic dream in a different way, which is I've covered 3 Olympics. There were still some bad hair choices. The one on the left there is from the Atlanta Olympics. There's a ponytail involved that you can't see. Yeah, nobody said anything to me at the time about there. I never let go of the fascination with sports. I never let go of the fascination with performance, and wondering what really led to those, to me, transcendent moments. Those moments where you watch somebody do something and it's beyond your understanding how physically they did that. And I was lucky enough to be in a stadium in London in 2012 and saw one of those moments. So I'm going to run video of the race, and then we'll talk about it. Pay special attention to the announcer here on this clip, because he's so good. I love that. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. That's so good. That was not the NBC call, obviously. And he talks about, he's retained his title in the most emphatic way, right? So when we watch that race, we're like, oh, he killed those guys, right? He just annihilated them. And he says, Usain Bolt is the fastest man on the planet. And in one sense, that's obviously true. We've all sort of agreed with one another. We're going to say, if you win the Olympic 100 meters, you're the fastest person on the planet. This is my view. This picture, to me, actually captures some of the speed. I like that my poor iPhone focused on the track rather than the runners. So that first blur is Bolt. There are 7 blurs right by the finish line there. This is the fastest 100 meters that it's ever been run. 7 of the 8 runners finished under 10 seconds, and the blur in back, who's way back there, is Asafa Powell, who pulled his hamstring halfway through the race and has actually run faster than 10 seconds more than any other man in history. And this would have been a race where everybody ran under 10 seconds, which is kind of astonishing. Here's a better view of it. This is the sort of photo finish tape, and these cameras spin. That's why his foot looks really weird and strange there. These not actually what happens. I want to talk about this idea, and that's variation. We think of that performance as truth. We think of that performance as what that athlete is capable, full stop. And that's not the case. Athletes have variation in their performance. Every day when an athlete goes out and does what he or she does, they do it differently, and you can actually build some science around it. Will Hopkins is an unbelievably brilliant sports scientist in New Zealand, and what he's particularly good at is the statistics side of this. So for those of you who are not statisticians, what he's trying to capture here is how much variation would you expect to see in a particular athlete's performance in a particular set of events. So what he's saying here in a running event less than 3 kilometers in length, the first line there, that you would tend to see a variation around 0.9 to 0.9%. You would see those differences in a performance at the same level of fitness. The same athlete with nothing changed about their circumstances other than just the randomness of being a human being would expect that difference in their performance. So if you take that back to this race in London, let's draw ourselves a curve around, that curve is 0.9%. The time is on this axis at the bottom. So Bolt could have run 0.9% faster, and that's 9:55, and annihilates his world record, and we all leave the stadium in London like holding our heads and being like, how did that, on earth did that happen? 0.9% slower is 9:71. He still wins the race in that point, but it's not 9:63, which is what he ran. Of course, he's not the only one who has this variation, so you can start to do this, which is kind of fun. You can imagine Johan Blake wins the gold, and you can Bolt and Justin Gatlin in a dead heat for silver. You can really make weird situations like a 3-way dead heat for gold. Tyson Gay just out of the medals. You can have everybody else be terrible, and Bolt, really beats them. Back to the real thing. Here's my point. What we view as the truth of a single performance is not the truth of a single performance. And the margins at this elite level are so small. They are so very small. 0.9% variation across these athletes totally changes the result of the race. And how do you operate in an environment where those little changes, those little things that make you a tiny bit better are so meaningful? And that's part of what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about that in the athletic context. I want to talk about it in the context of our lives as well, because I think there are some lessons that we can draw from this very rarefied world, and elite is by definition rarefied. But there are lessons that we can take from this world that I think are more broadly applicable to our lives, and so that's what we're going to talk about. Here's the first one. Lots of little things become big change. This is Dave Brailsford. I don't know if anybody watched the Tour de France just now. We have cycling fans in the room. Okay, we have some. So Dave Brailsford, this is a picture from the Olympics where he ran the British cycling team during the Olympics. He also manages Team Sky, and Chris Froome just won the Tour under his management this year for the second time. When Dave took over the British cycling program, it was a joke. It was a laughingstock. British cycling had not won a gold medal between 1924 and 1988. It had won 2 medals total in that time. It was a program that was nowhere in a sport, track cycling, that was dominated by the French, the Germans, some Italians, and actually Japan has a very strong track cycling culture, and so some Japanese riders. And when Dave came in and started working on that program, he realized that this was not a time to sort of continue what had been happening, because it was a failure. And so he tried to come up with a new framework, a new way of looking at the problem that could lead to improved performance. And what he hit on is an idea that he has explained as performance through the aggregation of marginal gains. So here's what he means by that. We as humans love the idea of a big fix. Let us find one big, if only I did X, I'd be much better at whatever I'm trying to get better at. Right? There's got to be that silver bullet out there that's really going to change my circumstance. British cycling hadn't been able to find that for 7 decades. And so Dave said, what if we think about this a different way? What if we think about not trying to do one thing revolutionarily better, but what if we try and think about doing dozens of things, hundreds of things, a little tiny bit better each? And it's a really interesting way to think about performance, because it becomes a manageable problem. it becomes an exhausting problem because suddenly every single thing that happens in the entire system is up for question. So you start to talk about your equipment. British Cycling went to a former Greek international track cyclist named Dimitris Konstantakis. He had been a track cyclist. He became a composites engineer and had worked on race cars and Formula One teams. And they went to him and said, "We want the best bike in the world." Said, okay. They formed a group that was known as the Secret Squirrel Club because they operated in such a hidden environment. And they developed this track frame, and they developed this set of handlebars that became known as the Cobra bars because of the aerodynamic bend there. And an interesting thing in track cycling now is the UCI, which is the world governing body for cycling, requires that any equipment raced in an elite race like this has to be made available to the public. You have to be able to buy it. I will say that it is not easy. So as I was researching the book, I started reaching out to British Cycling. It's like, I'm really interested in buying one of your bicycles. Like, could you please send me the information? And there was no response. So after 3 emails and 2 phone calls, I finally got, these are images from the catalog that they finally send you, which it's beautiful, and it touts the benefits of it, and it's the frame is a marvel of both aerodynamics and strength-to-weight ratio. It's an astonishing thing. What I've hidden here is the prices. I'll put them up there. So the type's a little small. So the frame is 25,000 pounds, not dollars. That's a lot. The bars are 23,000 because they're actually made bespoke. They're made to the measurement of your shoulders and your reach, and they're hand formed through carbon fiber layup for you. So that's 48, almost 49,000 pounds. Last night's exchange rate, that was $75,000. I imagine that is not the actual cost to British Cycling of them. I'm guessing there's a markup because you certainly would like to disincentivize, for instance, your competitors from just supplying their program through yours. But if anybody would like that, I do have the contact number for the people in charge. Look, you go down, you're in Mill Valley. There are people with really nice bikes here, and so you can outclass them all. So that's one vector British Cycling looks at. Here's another one. Every time I stay at a hotel, I wake up with a sore neck. Inevitably, because I'm sleeping on a pillow that I'm not used to. So that's actually, turns out you can solve that problem by bringing your own pillow. I'm not going to do that because that's semi-ridiculous, but British Cycling does. Every cyclist travels with their own pillow, which has 2 benefits. One is they're used to it, their neck's used to it. The other is they know who has slept on that pillow. Because getting sick is a real problem. 7% of all competitors at the London Olympics got sick. The IOC does a report at the end of it where they report how many people became ill during the Olympics. I cannot even imagine spending a lifetime building up to a day and waking up sick. That's terrible, and it's largely preventable. So when you interview a lot of these athletes and you go to shake their hand, they will not do it because they don't know where you've been. They don't know if you're sick. They're pretty obsessive about the hand washing, and they have their own pillow because they know that they've been sleeping on it, not some guy the night before who was ill in the hotel room. It's preventable. Beet juice is another thing that British Cycling has really doubled down on. For those of you who like your organic chemistry, and I know everybody loves organic chemistry, check me on it because they're both nitrates and nitrites. So beet juice has a high level of nitrate in it. The body transforms nitrate into nitrites and then into nitric oxide. So nitric oxide has 2 effects when it's in the blood. The first is it dilates your blood vessels. They get bigger which means more blood circulates through those blood vessels. If you're in a sport that requires your blood to circulate, an endurance sport, even a sort of medium endurance sport, track cycling has a lot of events that are sort of 6 to 8 minutes. That's a great thing. Nitric oxide also seems to make the mitochondria in your muscle cells more efficient. They produce the same amount of energy and consume less oxygen as they do it. Roundly a 3% gain in most of the studies. So that's a pretty good double header for an athlete. Like, you get more blood and you're using the oxygen in that blood more efficiently. That's awesome. That's free money. It was so popular. I was speaking to the scientist who's done a lot of this work. His name is Andrew Jones, and his handle on Twitter is Andy Beetroot. That's how much he writes about beet juice. He was telling me that during the London Olympics, it was actively difficult to buy beet juice in London because every nation was buying beet juice for their athletes. Any of you who have had beet juice will know that there are some weird side effects. This is a tweet from Mark Cavendish, a world championship cyclist. Strangely, that hashtag did not really take off. There, if you click on the hashtag, you see other people have used it, and there's not a lot of people who have used it. But there are. If you are interested in trying it, if you are an athlete, you will find that it does have some effects on there. Even down to many track cycling races start from a standing start. You're held up by a coach and you begin to pedal. And they did a bunch of tests to see how they could increase the traction at that moment. So they found if they wiped down the tires, these very high pressure racing tires with isopropyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol, that it increased the traction ever so slightly. And when I say ever so slightly, like maybe it makes 1,000th of a second difference. But 1,000th of a second is a margin by which races are won. Like races at that level have been they're timed to 1,000th of a second, and people have won it by exactly that. It matters. One more example from British cycling. This is Laura Trott, who won 2 gold medals in London, and she's wearing a pair of what British Cycling and Adidas, who developed these with them, referred to as hot pants, which has a different meaning to some people, but track cyclists warm up before the race. So they're on a stationary bicycle or a trainer, and they warm up, and then they go and they sit in a holding area before the race. And the effect of that is your muscles cool off as you sit there in that holding area. Sometimes you're there for up to half an hour. And so the benefits of the warm-up, we warm up because the circulation starts, because our muscles heat up. Warmer muscles perform better than cooler muscles. And they asked themselves, well, what can we do about this? And they created these pants that had heating elements in them. So they had basically like a heating pad built into it. It was not like crazy high technology, but it kept the muscles over 107 degrees rather than dropping down to body temperature. The first studies, they did not publish any of the studies until after the games because they found it was a huge competitive advantage. They found a 9% performance boost in their repeated sprint performance. Same athlete, warm up and not wearing the pants in that holding area, and then warm up and wearing the pants in that holding area. That's, I mean, 9% is bonkers. That's 9% is like doping level performance improvement. The upshot, here's Laura after winning her second gold medal. I love this picture of her family, and that's her mom sort of over her, on the left side of her head there. There were 10 track cycling gold medals awarded in London. British cycling won 7 of them. They should have won 9. They were disqualified in 2 races because of some technical, one rider went below a line and one slipped and fell off of the track. It's a dominating performance. It's been one of the most successful athletic programs of the past 2 decades. And the UK has really become a leader in sports science through this focus on all of these little things. You know, if you think about those piling those gains on each other, it's kind of like interest accruing, right? Now, you do one thing and you get a little bit, and then you do another thing a little bit more, but that doesn't change the first thing you did. You do another thing and it's a little bit more. It's a very, very powerful idea, and it's one that I actually find sort of compelling in everyday life, is getting out of that trap of looking for the one big silver bullet that's going to change everything, and looking for like, okay, like if I can do a couple more reps at the gym, if I can make sure that I go to the gym, if I can try and sleep another 10 minutes tonight, and maybe tomorrow I'll sleep another 10 after that. You start over time to get yourself into a place of actual big change. And behavior change is a very difficult thing, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So that's the first big idea I wanted to talk about. Here's the second one, n equals 1. So I'm not a scientist by training, I'm a journalist by training, but part of writing this book was reading a lot of sports science and talking to a lot of sports scientists, and this is scientific parlance. N is the population under study in a scientific paper. So, if n equals 100 in a study, that means there were 100 subjects in the study and you ran the experiment on them. When it comes to elite athletics, and I would actually argue when it comes to most things in our lives, n equals 1. We are so individual. And that sounds incredibly trite, but I'm going to ask you to like really dig into that notion. We are so incredibly individual in almost everything in our lives. From people react differently to training, people have different levels of motivation, people react differently to different nutritional regimes. I could eat the same thing that you eat every day, and our bodies will react differently to it. It's a huge, huge factor in what happens at the elite level. And it's especially true at the elite level because, again, we're talking about the far end of a curve. We're talking about a very unique population. Wendy Fox is a graphic designer in Melbourne, Australia, and I came across this online and I thought it was amazing. Hopefully, we'll zoom in. She did this infographic. This is every woman who won a gold medal in London. And she sort of did these proportional icons of each of them. So let me ask you a question. This is Helen Glover. Helen won a gold medal in the coxless pairs rowing event. She's 5'10". What percentage of women do you think are 5'10" or taller in America? 5, 12, somebody said 12, 10 to 15. Does anybody want to go higher? $1, right. 2.4% of women are 5'10" or taller. 2.4. So I'll be honest, I was sort of flabbergasted when I discovered that. You think of 5'10", it's like, oh, like tallish, but not like crazy tall. No, it's 2.4% of women are 5'10" or taller. So being tall is really an advantage in some sports. Basketball, we know. Volleyball, we know. Rowing is one of them. It's a physics problem, right? Rowing coaches talk about long levers. So the taller you are, the longer lever you have to pull against that oar, and it takes relatively less force for a tall rower than a shorter rower to do what they need to do. So UK Sport, recognizing this, they started this program. I love the name of it. The name of the program was Sporting Giants. And they put out a call for tall athletes. So for women, the cutoff was 5'10", and for men, the cutoff was 6'2", which is roundly the same percentage. A slightly higher percentage of men are taller than 6'2" than women are taller than 5'10". So Helen Glover had been a field hockey player. She'd been a pretty successful field hockey player, but she had been basically a state-level field hockey player in the UK scheme. And she just qualified for this, and she said, oh, okay, like I'm 5'10". And they went in and they tested her physiology, and it was bonkers. It was completely off the chart. She put up some of the best just cardiovascular numbers that the sports scientists had ever seen. And they said, this is great, this is what we're looking for. And so she started rowing, and 2 years after she got into a rowing shell for the first time, she won a gold medal in London. So remember when I was troubleshooting and talking about 10,000 hours? So like 10,000 hours is not necessary for world-class performance. Like elite ability is necessary, elite genetics are necessary, elite work ethic is necessary, but 10,000 hours is not. Of the 17 rowers who won gold in London, one is shorter than 5'10". That's not, and I will admit, I left the coxswain out. I cheated there. So, good catch. If you're 5'6" and have aspirations as a woman to row in the Olympics, I have really bad news for you. Your odds are infinitesimal. My odds of playing in the NBA, any chance of me playing in the NBA died not only with my athletic ability, but by the fact I'm 5'11" with that athletic ability. There are always outliers. Someone will say, well, what about Spud Webb, who was 5'6", or Muggsy Bogues, who was barely 5 feet, depending on who you believed. And yes, there are outliers to this, to steal Malcolm Gladwell's term, but it's really hard. It's hard. This is already really hard, and it's so much harder when your body is not matched up with the sport that you're trying to do. Wendy hadn't done this one. I actually asked her to do it. So this is Average Woman USA, and I feel like so the average woman in the United States is 5'4" and weighs 158 pounds. I'm always curious, people are blown away by that. Like, on both vectors? I'm just curious. I will say that average woman UK weighs 6 pounds less, which does not reflect well on us, but that's a whole different presentation, and we'll talk about that another time. Keep in mind this is the average. You've got to realize the variation around that average, that when you walk through the Olympic Village and see the types of athletes who are exceptional athletes in their sport and how different they are from one another, it's amazing. Gabby Douglas, 4'11" and 88 pounds. Also, like, don't kid yourself that gymnasts aren't like ungodly athletes. They're tiny, they are unbelievably strong, they're unbelievably quick, the power that these athletes have is astonishing. But being small is important. Rotationally, if I want to rotate something, a shorter thing is better, right? You don't see a lot of really tall gymnasts for a reason. It's hard to do the same rotations that a shorter gymnast does. The tallest gold medalist at the Olympics was Sylvia Fowles, who's 6'5". So that variation, that like when we say n equals 1, this is what I mean. That Gabby Douglas was never going to win an Olympic gold medal in basketball, and Sylvia Fowles was never going to win one in gymnastics. And realizing that, and there's a huge movement in the elite sporting arena to really focus on matching athletes to events based on their, not just physiology, but their morphology, the shape and size of their bodies. It can be a big advantage, and this is why. Data, so we talk a lot about data because we're in Northern California, and that's what we do, is we talk about data and computers and things like that. I happened to be on the phone the other day with a colleague of mine who's the editor of Sports Illustrated, and he said to me, nothing has changed sports more in the 20 years that I've been covering it than the availability and power of data to change our understanding of sports. And that's totally true. And from from books like Moneyball to the sabermetric revolution in baseball to what's happening in other sports now that we're going to talk about in a second. But I want to go back. These are the Hawthorne works in Cicero, Illinois, in about 1920. In the 20s, 40,000 workers worked in this plant every day. It was owned by Western Electric, which was part of the Bell system. So they made telephone equipment. And in the 20s, it was sort of the start of what was the idea that you could manage organizations scientifically. And researchers at Harvard were really starting this idea of scientific management and looking at your organization like a scientist. And then they came out to Hawthorne, and they spent a lot of time in this room with this group of people and then with a smaller group of people. This is the room where they made relay switches for switchboards. And they took some of the high performers, some of who they viewed as the best performers in this room, and I don't know if you can see, there's actually an interesting mix of men and women here, which was atypical, perhaps, of production jobs at the time. They took mostly women, actually, into a separate room, and they decided they were going to do experiments on how they could increase their productivity in making these switches. How could they make more switches per worker? And they sat them down in this room, and they put them in workstations identical to their current workstation, and they increased the level of light in the room. So there was more light than in this main room. And they made more switches. And guys stood there and counted how many switches they made, and there were some great pictures of white lab coats and clipboards, and like, okay, that's cool. So that confirmed one of our little hypotheses, oh, if they can see better in this intricate work, they can make more switches. So let's turn the lights back down, and they made more switches. And the researchers said, well, that's really, what? Well, maybe they're concentrating harder now because the light has gone away. So let's turn the lights down more, and they made more switches. Okay, what's up with that? And it's all right, well, let's put the lights back where they were, and they made more switches. So basically, every change of the condition that the researchers made, the experimental population, these people making switches, they made more each time until they ended up back in the original condition, and they were making significantly more than when they started out. So that's weird, right? It's non-intuitive. It's weird enough that this is the sort of thing that makes social scientists' heads explode, and they write lots of papers, and they get very excited about it, and they called it the Hawthorne effect. And the idea is people change their performance when they know they are being measured. The act of measurement, it's a little bit of the uncertainty principle, right? The act of measurement changes the performance. Even before you know what the data is, when you know somebody's watching you, you change what you're doing. Let me take a side note. This actually turns out to be an incredibly controversial study, and there's some suggestion that the data was bad or falsified because they were so into their conclusions. You can also explain some of it away, nobody had ever measured what they were doing. They had never gotten any feedback on their work and didn't think about ways to improve it. So there are lots of other factors you can look at to explain this phenomenon. But the fact remains that the idea of measurement changing performance, I think, is very real. And I think we see it in things like this. If you think about wearable technology and things that have come into our lives, gathering data used to be really, really hard. And it's trivial now. Whether it's a wearable, whether it's many of us in our phone have a computer that has an accelerometer, a GPS, a gyroscope in it. I can tell you where it is in space and time at any moment if I really want to. That is a level of information gathering that was impossible, even at the start. We'll harken back to my ill-fated cycling career. This was my coach. Eddie Borshevsky was the national bicycle team coach, and he wrote this book called Bicycle Road Racing, which I still own. This is a picture of my copy. And in it included such suggestions to me that if it was really hot out, if I needed to manage my temperature, I could put a cabbage leaf under my cycling cap, and it would So these are Tour de France riders in the 1930s employing this strategy. Here's the thing, it totally works. Because it does feel cool on your head and you get the evaporative cooling, but it also, as beet juice, it has side effects, not the same ones. It has sort of olfactory side effects. This is a guy who was the coach of the 1984 United States Olympic cycling team. And when I'm reading this book in 1986, he's telling me about cabbage under my hat. Right. In the same era, this device came out. This is the Polar Sports Tester PE300, and I owned one of these, oddly. So I had a job at a radio station, and I saved up all of my money, and I spent it on esoteric cycling gear because I really liked gear and technology, and all that's changed now is I get the gear and I'm not racing. Polar developed the first wireless heart rate monitor in 1977 for Finnish cross-country skiers. And this was the first one that was really marketed to consumers. I'd strap it, it had the electrodes, and I'd strap it to my handlebars, and it would measure my heart rate for me. And I suddenly had this information like, oh, my heart rate is 120 beats per minute. And I had no idea what that meant. Was that a lot? Was I working hard? Like there was some very, very nebulous concept of target zones. For those of you who do endurance sports, sort of endurance zone and tempo zone. Fast forward more years than I would like to admit. Wahoo is a company that makes a networked cycling trainer. This is a ride that I did one day. This is second by second my power output in every pedal stroke of the ride, mapped with my heart rate, mapped with the training stress, the calories burnt, the net power, my target power, watts per kilogram, my heart rate. This data would have utterly changed my life back then, because what this allows you to do is actually know what you're doing. And we had no idea what we were doing. We went, as you said, we just went out and rode our bike. And for a long time, that was enough to let me win bike races. And then it turned out it wasn't nearly enough at all. And it does make me wonder, like, if I had known this and if I'd been able to train in a way that actually tapped into my potential, what could that potential have been? Zwift is a company out here. I love this. This is a cycling virtual world. So this is me racing other people in real time on that trainer with a computer. So I'm doing 239 watts at that moment, which is a fair amount for me. There are professional cycling teams, pro tour teams, recruiting riders from this game. Because at the end of the day, one of the things that's there's a reason that cycling is a nexus for some of this research. Part of it is, and the reason it's a nexus for my thinking about it, part of it is it's my experience, but it's also, cycling's a pretty easy math problem to solve. I can measure directly how much power I produce by putting a strain gauge on the cranks. So I know the wattage. I know how much I weigh, and you can do some math and figure out like what that ratio needs to be an elite racer. So it turns out 6.1, 6.2 watts per kilogram. If you can sustain that for 30 minutes, you can certainly podium at the Tour de France, and you can probably win it. So if you can see some kid in Little Rock, Arkansas on Zwift who's racing at, say, 65 kilograms and doing climbs at 450 watts, you would like to talk to him, like right now. There are other ways of measuring things in other sports. This is Catapult Sports, is an Australian company. Before the UK really took the lead in this area, Australia was a huge world leader in sports science. And this technology came out of the Australian Institute of Sport. It's basically a super ruggedized sensor package. So GPS, accelerometers, gyroscopes, many gyroscopes actually, because it's trying to measure both acceleration and deceleration in real time. It lives sort of there between the shoulder blades. It's worn a lot in a lot of sort of commonwealthy sports. So this is Brian O'Driscoll, who's a rugby player. Australian rules football, it's used a lot. Many NBA teams with the Warriors wear it in practice every day. When I talked to Andre Iguodala after the season, they're measuring the training stress. They're measuring how much these guys run during practice. They're charting it over time. So if they notice, Andre was telling me that if they notice on Tuesday, hey, you're not running as fast as you were on Sunday after the game, maybe you should sit it out today. Maybe you should take a day off. Maybe we should change your training regimen. That level of granularity, that ability to really fine-tune how you're applying a stimulus to an athlete is a huge advantage, especially in a team sport that has such a long season. So one factor in the Warriors championship was they were incredibly healthy. They lost so few games to injury and almost none from their key players. And in talking to Andre, that they talked about that every day, that they weren't worried about February, they were worried about June, and it paid off with the first title in 40 years. None of the American pro leagues are wearing these sorts of trackers in the competitive environment yet, although it's very likely to happen, I would guess, in the next 2 years. One of the reasons it hasn't happened yet is actually questions from the players' unions about it. It's the downside as a player is that same conversation, one way an organization approaches that problem is, hey, Andre, you weren't running as fast today, so let's have you rest. Another way you approach it is at contract time. You say, hey, Andre, you aren't running as fast as you used to, so we're going to really need to look at your salary because you're clearly on the downside of your career. We had a conversation at the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference about this, and Andrew Hopkins, who's a wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns, said, basically, I don't want them to know this about me. I want to hide my decline as long as possible. And of course you do as an athlete. You want to extend your career as long as you can. So there's a really interesting tension there that is going to happen. It's already coming up in the NBA's negotiations around their new collective bargaining agreement, which is going to hopefully not result in a lockout in 2017, but very well might. Once you have the data, data is not information, data is data. Data tells me what happened. It doesn't tell me what to do about it or why. You need to be able to examine that data. So this is Kirk Goldsberry. I write about Kirk in the book. He's a cartographer from Harvard and a crazy, crazy NBA fan, and also a really dedicated pickup basketball player. And one day he was playing with his friends and got to thinking, I love taking this shot from the right baseline and I hate it from the left baseline. I have places that I'm very comfortable shooting on the court, and I have places that I'm incredibly uncomfortable shooting on the court. I wonder if NBA players have that. It was a problem he was uniquely equipped to solve because it's a spatial problem, it's a mapping problem. What he needed was data. So the first data that he got was he went to ESPN's website, and they do shot charts on the ESPN site where the shot's taken and whether it goes in or out. And behind that is a big XML file, just basically data. And he built a semi-illegal web scraper to scrape that data and put it in a big database and started to analyze it. And when you analyze it, you start to get a map like this. So the size of the dot is how frequently a player shoots from a particular spot, and the sort of blue to red axis is how effective they are compared to the league average from that spot. So this is Dirk Nowitzki. Nowitzki loves that sort of right side of the court mid-range. Takes a ton of shots there, he's very effective. Takes a lot of shots from that left side mid-range, and he's not nearly as effective. This is sort of a fingerprint of a player's offensive game. So Kirk unveiled this. He did a paper at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, which is sort of like nerd stock for sports data. And people went insane. Like Mark Cuban, who owns the Dallas Mavericks, grabbed him after the presentation and said, I want to buy all of your intellectual property right now. How much do you want? R.C. Buford, who's the general manager of the Spurs, took him out to dinner that night. Kirk went from sort of a map professor at Harvard to one of the more influential researchers in the game of basketball through that work. Then he got an even cooler data set. Here in the foreground there, that's a camera. That's Stats Inc. is a company in Chicago, and they have this system called SportView. There are 6 cameras around the arena, and it captures the position of every player and every object on the court, including the ball and the officials, 25 times a second. It was actually based on Israeli missile technology. There was a technology to sort of target missiles. And for each thing, it gives you an XY coordinate. The data set for a game is nearly a terabyte of data. And for those of you who aren't technologists, a terabyte is like a crazy amount of data. And you start to add up an NBA season, and you're in the sort of petabyte range. So now you can start to do research like this. So this shows you the average opponent's scoring percentage in the NBA based on where they take the shot. Perhaps not surprisingly, that's the rim in the center. The closer you are to the rim, the more likely you are to make the shot. This is the area near the basket is the most important thing to defend in a basketball game. And so this is what you might expect. But those numbers change based on who's playing defense in that area. So I'm going to pick on the lately departed David Lee, who is a horrible interior defender. That's awful. Remember, that's average. That's what happens when David Lee is defending a guy at the rim. There's a reason that he fell out of the rotation with Steve Kerr, who was very worried about rim protection. Compare that to Larry Sanders, who played for the Bucks, and his ability to suppress scoring near the rim is an incredibly valuable skill that frankly was overlooked for a long time in the NBA. You had a sense like, oh, he's really hard to score on inside, but this tells a very clear story. He signed a $44 million contract the summer after Kirk published this research. Of course, there's another way to defend, and I love this idea. So you can suppress the success of shots that are taken, or you can prevent a shot from being taken at all. So Dwight Howard at the time was a member of the Lakers. When Dwight Howard was on the court defending at the rim, opponents took 9% fewer shots than when an average defender was there. So we talk about block shots, and Howard blocks a lot of shots. He averages 3.5 a game. This is a virtual block shot. Opponents won't even take the shot when he's there, and you can't make a shot that's not taken. Daryl Morey is the general manager of the Houston Rockets, and a very data-driven. He's actually one of the founders of this Sloan Sports Conference that I've mentioned. He's very data-driven. He was in the crowd when Kirk presented this research, and 4 months later signed Howard to a huge contract because he was so blown away by the numbers. This is what he wants to see, but he also wants to see shots not even going up at the rim. A couple of other things I'd like to talk about, and then we'll have some time to address questions. Atul Gawande he's an unbelievably brilliant writer, and in one of his books he talks about how bad we are doing the stuff we know works. That we're nowhere near doing even the things that we already know are effective, like, again, going to the gym. So getting the basics right is actually a really powerful thing to do, because a lot of your competition, not just athletically, but our competition in life, probably isn't. So let's talk about sleeping more. Yes, sleep. So I am not a great sleeper. I need to take some of these lessons to heart. This is the 2005-2006 Stanford Cardinal basketball team. They weren't very good. They 16 and 14, they lost in the second round of the NIT. What's interesting about them is that they took part in a sleep study. Sherry Ma is a researcher at the Stanford Sleep Center. And she went around to every varsity team at Stanford and said, look, I want to do an experiment. I want to see what happens to your team's performance if they sleep more. And basically every team said, No. And the basketball team said, sure, let's figure it out. So she started by gathering data on their baseline sleep. And she asked each of the players, like, oh, how much do you sleep a night? And they're like, oh, yeah, it's 7 hours, 8 hours. The average was about 7.8. Then she put sensors, you have sort of an accelerometer on your wrist, and measured how much they actually slept, and it was under 7. So first of all, we over-report our sleep constantly. So they established the baseline, and they did some basketball drills. They did sort of a running drill where you go baseline to center court, back to the baseline, back to the far baseline and back. It's a pretty standard basketball drill. They shot three-pointers and they shot free throws. So they had the baseline condition. And then she said the only direction she gave them was sleep more. So they started at roundly an average of 6 2/3 hours a night. She said sleep more, and they got up to almost 8.5 a night. Which would be awesome. 8.5 hours of sleep sounds pretty great, right? Perhaps it's not going to come as a surprise that. So we think of sleep as being a good thing, and we'll feel better and do better. But like, it's not just doing better. It's you're a better athlete. They were 0.7 of a second faster. Their free throw percentage improved by 9%. Their three-point shooting percentage by 9% as well. As I said, 9%, that's doping level performance enhancement. Like, we have such weird cultural stuff about sleep in the United States. I can't tell you how many people when I talk about this, say like, yeah, but I only need 5 hours, and you need more. If anybody's sitting there thinking like, I don't need that much sleep, you're sleep deprived and you don't know it, and you've come to accept that as your regular state. And one way of potentially breaking out of this sort of trap that we find ourselves in both culturally and sort of mentally is, people think of sleep as a chore. Like, oh, think of I'll sleep when I'm dead, I'll do that, right? Like, I have so many other things I'd rather do. Like, no, like, reconceptualize it. Think of sleep as a performance enhancer. Like, think of, if I sleep an hour more a night, I'm 9% better at what I do. I'll take that investment any day of the week. That seems like pretty good return on it to me. Here's the last thought I want to leave you with. Scott Dror was a sports scientist, and he said this to me. He said, the only sustainable competitive advantage is to learn faster than your opposition. And it's a quote. It actually comes from Royal Dutch Shell. So Arie de Geus was one of the real architects of what's now known as scenario planning. So de Geus ran a group in the 70s at Shell that said, okay, so like, what happens if tomorrow oil is $100 a barrel? And they would try and model their business to account for a fundamental change in the business. They would say, what would happen if oil was $20 a barrel? And it turns out that not long after they started these exercises, the price of oil cratered after OPEC reopened a market that they had closed. And Shell thrived in that environment because they'd already thought about it. They already had a plan, while the rest of their competition was sort of like running around in the freak out mode, like, oh, good news, we have a plan. We're going to be more selective in where we drill. We've been drilling in marginal places because oil's been expensive. Now we're not going to do that. Because I like underdogs, I'm an A's fan. Yay! Go A's. 510, exactly. So, the A's under Billy Beane have really, the A's under Billy Beane. Moneyball really made a big deal about the notion that they had discovered different truths about baseball. And Michael Lewis is a brilliant writer, and it's one of my favorite books of all time, but it's an oversimplification of what happened, because a lot of the ideas that the A's implemented in the Moneyball years had existed in a small baseball research community. Sometimes Bill James, sort of the grandfather of a lot of this, he had been doing some of this research in the 70s when he was a night watchman at a pork and beans plant in Kansas by hand, because That's how you got baseball stats. So some of the insights were not novel. What was novel was their ability to align their organization against those insights, to take those ideas and act on them more quickly and in a more committed manner than their competition. They learned faster than the competition. And when 2 years later, everybody was looking for guys with high on-base percentages and really valuing walks, Bean pivoted and started looking for great defensive players. He decided that defense was actually the undervalued asset in the market. He learned faster and had another wave of success. And after that became a metric that people were looking at, he pivoted again, and he looked at the notion of how flexible a roster can I create? Can I create a roster that's not like a bunch of superstars and a bunch of like okay players, but a bunch of really good players? And if I bring my average level player up and can move them around, can I have success that way? And he's had success that way. The A's are an organization that have, unfortunately, not won the titles that the Giants have recently, he says as a fan, but have found different ways to tackle the intellectual problem of winning baseball games on a constricted budget. 3 different ways in the past decade. That's learning faster than your opposition. What that idea really says to me is like all any of us can do is keep our eyes and ears and most importantly our minds open to all the possibilities in a given situation. We have to have a willingness to try things and learn from mistakes and fail and move on. I think I certainly get stuck in my ways. I think all of us get stuck in our ways. And we find ourselves falling behind competition that's more nimble, more willing to experiment, and more comfortable with pushing the boundaries. That's the awesome joy and the horrible torment of working on the cutting edge of science and performance. Today's greatest innovations, tomorrow's baseline. When British cycling shows up with that track frame or hot pants, like at the next competition, everybody has hot pants on. It's done as a competitive advantage, and you have to keep pushing forward, and you have to keep trying to find new and different ways to excel. So that's my talk. We do have books, and I'm super happy to sign them, but I think we also have time for some questions. I don't know how you... Yeah, so I'll repeat the questions once.
Tell us, please, again, the name of the MIT Sloan guy who came up with the basketball metric.
Sure.
And it's interesting to me, I imagine there's a few basketball fans in this audience that we haven't really seen that in the press recently, have we?
They don't read Wired magazine. Thank you. They don't. We did publish an excerpt in Wired. So this is Kirk Goldsberry is his name. He writes also at a site called Grantland.com, and he does analysis like this at Grantland, and is a fascinating writer. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Books that apply more to playing the piano than athletics. So here's what I would argue, actually, is that what you're talking about mostly is strategies towards mastery of specific physical domains. And so part of why Anders Ericsson's research into 10,000 hours has been applied so broadly is they're similar processes, right? The process of mastering the physical skill of playing a piano is not as far away from mastering the physical skill of shooting a bow and arrow as you might think. And so many of these strategies in terms of, so what I didn't talk a lot about here, and there's a chapter in the book about skill acquisition, like what are the best ways to acquire new skills. And some quick highlights, we tend to practice in very blocked ways, like I'm going to learn a piano song by playing these 4 measures until I get them right, and then these 4 measures. And while that can be a good way to initially learn something, it does not lead to great retention or great fluidity. Randomized practice is a much better way to learn things. And also making sure that you want random, not blocked practice. And the more you can simulate the ultimate environment in which you want to perform, the better. So in the sports world, a lot of coaches now are talking about the idea that nothing teaches the game better than the game itself, right? That we run practices. You run a volleyball practice where like a coach will toss a player a ball and they'll set balls for like an hour. And in a actual volleyball game, you might get one set that's right there, and everything else you have to be moving and adjusting for. And so that when you learn these skills in a way that's so divorced from the actual performative or competitive environment, it leads to lesser mastery. So in terms of specific books about musical skill acquisition, I'm a little out of my depth, so I'm gonna have to not have any suggestions for you. I'm sorry.
I understand that the water in Rio is so polluted that Olympic contenders in water-related events are going there before to get sick with the bacteria, so they build up an immunity and they won't be sick for the...
It is one strategy people are looking at. Sorry if everybody didn't hear that. There have been some stories recently. The water in Rio is not good. And some competitors have come up with the idea of going to Rio early, getting sick ahead of time, and then being able to compete. It's sort of like, I don't know if anybody's mothers, or my mother didn't do this, but she told me stories of my mother's grandmother, my great-grandmother, like if one of the kids got chicken pox, that they just bring everybody in to make sure just everybody got it at once and they'd be done with it. It's a little bit like the athletic world equivalent of that. There's some huge controversy, and actually the IOC the International Olympic Committee is really concerned about this as a potential huge problem in Rio.
They were supposed to have cleared it up, but they didn't.
It is not a trivial problem in the infrastructure in Rio, yeah. Marion.
Did any of your research address doping and your point about staying ahead of the competition and being able to detect doping? And
Did my research, the question is about doping. This is the first talk I've ever given where doping wasn't the first question. So there is a chapter on doping in the book. It's a really hard and awful subject to write about, and actually part of the chapter I write about how much I didn't want to write a chapter about doping because I'm sick of it and talking about it. I don't have a lot of insights. One of the real problems is we don't know the science of doping. The real data on the effectiveness of doping is not available to us, because the real people who know how effective doping is are not letting us know that they're doping. The only good science we have is actually from the East German archives after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and a scientist and his wife, who had been a track athlete, saved boxes and boxes of the archives from destruction as the wall was falling, and wrote a paper that was in a journal like the Annals of Chemistry that reads like a spy novel. It's an amazing piece of reporting. And there were these reports where the Stasi, the secret police, ran the program. They ran a doping program where every East German athlete, and especially the women, were doped very heavily. And they were seeing 10 to 12% gains in some events. Doping, especially with steroids, is a very effective thing for female athletes because of the lower levels of testosterone in their bodies. So we don't know very much about the science of it. The other thing that I think is interesting to think about, I've argued in the past, and it's an argument a lot of people make, like, oh, let's let everybody do whatever they want, right? It's a level playing field. And it's not a level playing field. It's just a different unlevel playing field. N equals 1 with doping too. If I have a certain level of red blood cells in my body, and you have a different level of red blood cells in your body, and we both take EPO and push ourselves up to the legally allowed level in cycling, for instance, I might have gotten a 10% gain and you might have gotten a 3% gain. This is something that Tyler Hamilton wrote about in his book when he sort of came clean about his doping. So the idea that if we let everybody do whatever they want, that it's a level playing field is inaccurate. It's just a different unlevel playing field.
I think in your NPR interview a couple months back, you said that you thought that on most of these sports, all the really big gains have already been made by this point. Like, we're not going to see someone high jump 12 feet, improve another couple feet on high jump. Whereas if you compare high jump what it used to be, yeah, we've improved a couple feet on that, but it's not going to happen again. I'm a rower.
Mm-hmm.
The Helen Glover story seems to happen a lot in rowing. Like, for me, I didn't start rowing until my freshman year of college. A lot of people don't start until really, really late, and they can still make it to the top level. But it doesn't seem like that same thing. Like, if you're a soccer player and you start playing when you're 18 or 20 years old, you're probably not going to make the Olympic team.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on, like, rowing? It's not a new sport. It's one of the few sports that's been in the Olympics since the beginning of the modern Olympics. But why? It seems like we haven't actually quite figured it out. Someone can be a gold medalist 2 years after the first stroke.
So I think you've hit on two interesting things there. One is the contrast between sports that are very largely physiologically determined, and I will put rowing in that category, I put cycling in that category, I'd put running in that category, I'd put cross-country skiing in that category. They do have technique, but at the end of the day, it's a contest of sort of lungs and circulation and how hard you can push yourself for how long. As opposed to soccer, which has huge physiological demands, but also has a massive skill component. And in defensive 10,000 hours, the more skill-based a sport is, the more you do see a correlation between the length of time somebody has been doing that sport and their relative level of success. So I think that's a big one. I think the other idea you hit on is sort of the saturation of a particular sport in terms of reaching populations. So worldwide, soccer is an immensely saturated sport. Beyond the United States, there are very few potential great soccer players who fall through the cracks. There are very few potential great runners who fall through the cracks worldwide. Like, you see a fast kid, and you know that kid's fast and can do the things that start a kid on a pathway to who knows where. If I live in the middle of Idaho, 600 miles from the nearest rowing club, I'm never going to have any opportunity. I'm never even going to know about the sport, let alone have an opportunity to try it, see if I'm suited to it, if I like it, and if I'm going to be filtered into that. So I think you do, with relatively less saturated sports, still have that potential of finding athletes and really fast-tracking them. And frankly, that's what programs like the Sporting Giants program does, is try and take athletes and fast-track them into sports that have relatively easier pathways. Yes?
I guess this is a terminology question, and the Hawthorne effect, being that people perform better when they're measured. Is there a name for, have you run across any research, a name for the effect of, Bob Beamon I think in the 1968 Olympics, just shattered
Yes.
the long jump record by more than 2 feet. But what started happening was that this unseeable record, people started, getting closer and closer to. I mean, it took a long time for people to break his
So there is something very powerful, and then I want to talk about the long jump because it's 4-minute mile is a much better example. So Beamon is actually, So Beeman's jump 29.2 and 3/4 is maybe the single greatest outlier performance in the history of sports. It was, the measuring equipment couldn't measure far enough out. There was an optical thing, and they kept pushing it out to the end of the track, and it fell off the end of the track, and it took them 10 minutes to measure it because they had to go find a tape measure to do it. He never jumped anywhere near close to that again, and it wasn't broken for almost 25 years until Mike Powell broke it in his great duel with Carl Lewis in 1987. 4-minute mile is a much better example. There were tons of runners running 4 minutes, half a second, 4:01s, like people nibbling around it. And Bannister goes out and runs 3:59.4, and a week later, 2 other runners had done it. The demonstration there is something, as you say, very powerful, and I'm sure there probably in the social science literature is a name for this effect. There's something very powerful about the notion of knowing something is possible. Once you see someone else do something, you now know it's possible. It's almost the way that people used to talk about the sound barrier before Chuck Yeager broke it as like a farm you could buy in the sky. That was the phrase. It's like, it's a wall. It's never going to happen. And like planes kept falling apart and people kept ejecting, and Yeager goes and breaks it one day, and 2 years later, people are flying Mach 2.5 in fighter jets. It wasn't once you knew you could do it, you just did it. Yes?
You talk about athletes improving their performance through equipment or training or psychological coaching.
Sure.
I'd like to bring up another point. I'm a doctor. About 20 years ago, there was some research carried out among racial types on the elasticity of the muscle fiber. And it seemed to favor one racial type
Mm-hmm.
opposed to another. Then all that research seemed to die out. I wonder whether it died out for political reasons.
Yes.
Do you know anything about that?
So it died out for political reasons. So let me be careful politically as I phrase this. As you say, there was research into the elasticity of muscle fiber. There was also research into various genetic differences in how different proteins were expressed and how that had effects potentially related to to fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. So, people of Western African descent, as a population, generally have a larger proportion of fast twitch muscle fibers in their body than people not of West African genetic descent. Setting aside that we're all West African genetic descent, but that is true. What people tend to draw a line from then is African Americans are better sprinters than Caucasians. And that is not true. Population-wise, as a geneticist, you are more likely to find a great sprinter. There is probably a larger proportion of people with the genetic proclivity to be a great sprinter in a West African descended population than a Caucasian descended population. But it's not a line. It's a population game. You might say that 1 in 10,000 kids in Jamaica have a particular ability, and maybe it's 1 in 100,000 kids in Indiana have that same ability. So where people run into that is conflating the possibility with the reality and drawing that straight line between them. Is that careful enough? Molly.
Are there any sports that have resisted this kind of analysis?
So I think a lot of sports, interestingly, I think there's a really inherent conservatism in a lot of sports. I'm sorry, are there any sports that have resisted this sort of technology analysis or sort of, let me go a little broader, like sort of treating it in this sort of scientifically driven way? And And I think it's less sport by sport, but more organization by organization. So you have some organizations in, let's take the NBA, that are very forward thinking. The Warriors happen to be one of them. You have some that are incredibly uninterested in these ideas. You have organizations like the Indiana Pacers that have said, like, yeah, we don't really, it's not of interest to us. And I think they're hugely misguided and wrong, but it tends to happen more at an organization by organization level. And as the ideas spread, so taking back to baseball, Moneyball was this whole, like, holy crap thing. Like, part of the central tension of Moneyball was the argument between sort of the quants and the scouts, like the stats guys and the guys who, like, I know a great player when I see him on the field. A little bit of it's a writer's trick. It's like, you need that conflict in the middle of the book. That's not an argument in baseball anymore. Like, that was set up as an either or, and the answer, of course, is both. The answer is, science and data can confirm your observations, and your observations can check the science and data. And, like, if I have data that tells me the best strategy in an NBA game is to shoot half-court shots all night, like, I probably, like, intuitively, I know that's a little weird, and I should probably look at that. So I think the most effective organizations now are the ones that are able to take these ideas and blend them with what's finding ways to be really effective with sort of old school methods and mix in the new school. I don't know how much more time we have, but yeah.
So this is all well and good when you're talking about professional sports, Division I basketball, lots of money on the line, etc. I worry a little bit about a moral hazard that starts to trickle down into high school and junior high school and young kids. Whether people are going to apply data to say, no, I don't want this kid on my soccer team because he's too short, or that kind of thing. Has that happened? Do you think that's going to happen?
Yeah. Well, China's been doing it for a long time, but yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I'm sure I'm sure somebody would tell me stories, will tell me stories when we finish. I think the bigger pathology is actually our view of what we want youth sports to accomplish. And I write about this some in the book. When my dream of being a professional cyclist was frankly ridiculous, right? So statistically, it's impossible to win an Olympic gold medal, right? Just like if like it's one in a, so Usain Bolt is one of a population of, like, let's call it 3.2 billion human males on the planet. Like, statistically, that's impossible. No one can do it except somebody does it every time, and so we figure it out. If the best athlete at my high, like the best athlete I ever saw and played games against in person was a kid named Bill Bliss. He was the kid who, in my small town, was scoring 25 points a night at the basketball team and the quarterback of the football team, and hitting like 600 in baseball. He was drafted by the Cubs in like the 32nd round. He made it to Double-A, and the fact to me that, like, he made us look like a joke, like we were not worthy to be playing against him, and he came nowhere even within sniffing being a marginal major league player, let alone a star in the major leagues. And please, those of you who are parents with kids in sports, the goal is not for them to be elite. Like, if they are, they will find their way there, and you actually don't have to make them do it. And frankly, you can't make them do it because the intrinsic drive has to come from within. Like, what you want is for them to have fun and enjoy themselves and derive the lessons that I really strongly believe exist in sports about teamwork and disappointment and overcoming obstacles. But of course it's going to happen, and it's heartbreaking. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, kind of following up on the last question, this is just fascinating. It's focused on professional athletes, the elite. But you also talk about being able to apply these same principles maybe kind of outside the context of professional athletes. And I'm just wondering, where do we go with that?
Right.
the notion of bringing into our educational system, kind of retraining in terms of it's lots of little things that might matter to advance you rather than, test scoring on a particular topic. So I'm just wondering, where do you take this? What's the next step? And where do you get the interest in putting the type of resources into looking at more practical applications into, the non-elite athletes, even outside athletics?
Right.
With what you're doing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. Part of the reason it's relatively easier to do at the elite athletic level is the amount of money that's involved at the elite athletic level, right? You mentioned the education system, and I wish I had great solutions to the education system, but I think you're right. I think that these ideas of how we measure success and the real attributes that lead to increased performance, that I tried to highlight some of, the idea of marginal gains, the idea of trying to learn faster and be flexible and challenging in your thinking, the ideas of the importance of data and tracking information that Peter Drucker's quote, what's measured gets managed. What I'm able to do at my level is to talk about them and try and introduce people to these ideas, but to really get them into things like educational change that's a pretty big lift. I don't have any silver bullets there, unfortunately. So.
You talked a bit about athletes generating data. Do you have examples of athletes that are consuming data to impact their training and performance?
Yeah, it's so Kirk sat down and did an interview with LeBron James and brought in the maps to LeBron and sat down. It's like, here's your shot charts, and LeBron looked at it. It's like, oh, I got to work on my wing jumper. It's like, that's a shot that I take a lot in our system, and I'm not performing at the level that I think I should. I had no idea until you just showed me that. Endurance athletes, again, are huge data junkies, and the ease of gathering that data and feeding it back into the training. What's happening, as I said, with the charting of things like the health of players during the season and the training loads, that's being fed back into the system. That's the real power there, is feeding it back into the system and having the behavior change come from it. Or is that one more that you're telling me, or is that telling me to stop? One.
One more, but I also want to mention, because you talked about sleep,
Yes.
our November 1st Fridays on sleep.
Woo!
We have the director of the sleep lab from Berkeley, not Stanford.
Another good lab. Yes.
And one more to give people time to have their book signed and talk to you afterwards.
Okay.
I was particularly impressed by the notion of marginal gains, not so much in sports, but in science.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out that right now, very close to us at the Buck Institute, the founder of the original CEO of the Buck Institute has a program where he uses 35 different techniques, including sleep and exercise and antioxidants and nerve growth factors, and he's finding very significant gains in Alzheimer's patients.
Mm-hmm.
This guy I worked with him for 2 years as a volunteer after I retired, and he's no good.
No, it's
Very exciting new direction.
I mean, it's a very exciting time, and I think that's, yeah, so the question was more a comment about some Alzheimer's research that's being done and sort of multifactorial research, so not, again, looking for just one intervention, but piling interventions on top of one another. I mean, let me just leave you all with how you mentioned sort of the frontiers of performance and what are those limits of performance. And Red Bull, the energy drink company, actually runs a giant sports science department. They have a lot of sports science researchers who support their sponsored athletes. And I was down at their lab and I was talking to them, And I'm like, well, obviously there's a limit, right? There's a point where we won't high jump 12 feet. Like, nobody's ever going to run 100 meters in 5 seconds. And Andy Walsh, who runs the lab, he's Australian, looked at me, he's like, why not? I'm like, well, because you can't. He's like, look, somebody will run 100 meters in 5 seconds someday. It just might not look like what we think human beings look like today. So thank you, everybody, for coming. I appreciate it.